The sun was setting over the small town of Pine Grove when Mr. and Mrs. Chen pulled into the local gas station in their well-maintained 1985 Buick. They had just finished their weekly dinner at their granddaughter's house, a tradition they'd maintained for the past decade. At 75 and 73 years old respectively, these moments with family were what they lived for. The fluorescent lights of the gas station buzzed overhead as Mr. Chen carefully stepped out of his car, his weathered hands gripping his worn leather wallet. Mrs. Chen sat in the passenger seat, working on her crossword puzzle, something she'd done every evening for as long as anyone could remember. What started as a routine stop would soon turn into something neither of them could have anticipated. The peaceful evening air was suddenly filled with the thunderous roar of motorcycle engines. A group of 7 bikers, their leather vests adorned with patches and pins, pulled into the station, their chrome exhausts gleaming under the harsh station lights. The leader of the group, a towering figure with a thick gray beard and arms covered in faded tattoos, dismounted his bike first. His heavy boots scraped against the concrete as he surveyed the nearly empty station. His eyes landed on the elderly couple, and a smirk crossed his weather-beaten face. Unknown to everyone present, Officer Rodriguez was parked in the shadows behind the station, finishing up his paperwork from an earlier incident. He had chosen this quiet spot specifically to complete his reports, but his trained eye noticed the sudden change in atmosphere as the bikers arrived. The biker leader nudged 2 of his companions, younger men with matching skull bandanas, and jerked his head toward the elderly couple. They snickered, already moving toward Mr. Chen, who was struggling with the gas pump. Mrs. Chen looked up from her puzzle, her reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose, concern evident in her eyes. "Hey, old-timer," the leader called out, his voice gravelly and loud enough to make Mr. Chen jump slightly. "Having trouble with that pump? Maybe you should let someone younger handle it." His companions laughed, the sound echoing across the empty station. Mr. Chen's hands trembled slightly as he tried to insert his credit card. He had lived through much worse in his life, having immigrated to America with nothing but hope and determination 40 years ago. But age had made him more cautious, more aware of his vulnerability. The 3 bikers surrounded him now, their shadows looming over his smaller frame. Mrs. Chen watched helplessly from the car, her crossword forgotten as she reached for her phone with shaking hands. The remaining 4 bikers had spread out around the station, effectively blocking any easy escape route. "Look at him shake," one of the younger bikers taunted, reaching out to poke Mr. Chen's shoulder. "Maybe it's past your bedtime, Gramps." The others joined in with more laughter, their voices growing louder and more threatening with each passing moment. Officer Rodriguez had already silently radioed for backup, but he knew waiting wasn't an option. Through his years of experience, he could read situations like this all too well. The tension was escalating, and the elderly couple was clearly terrified. He quietly opened his car door, years of training allowing him to move without drawing attention. As the leader reached for Mr. Chen's wallet, claiming he would help with the transaction, no one noticed the police officer approaching from the shadows. The security cameras continued to record silently, capturing every moment of what was about to unfold at this seemingly peaceful gas station on the outskirts of Pine Grove. The air grew thick with tension as Mr. Chen clutched his wallet tighter, his years of hard work and dignity refusing to let him simply hand it over. Mrs. Chen had managed to dial 911, but her trembling fingers hadn't yet pressed the call button. The station's fluorescent lights continued to buzz overhead, casting harsh shadows that made the scene feel even more menacing. Little did the bikers know, their evening of intimidation was about to take an unexpected turn, and Officer Rodriguez was about to remind them that appearances can be deceiving in the most memorable way possible. Officer Rodriguez took measured steps across the parking lot, his movements deliberate and calm despite the urgency of the situation. In his 15 years on the force, he had learned that sometimes the most powerful approach was the quiet one. The fluorescent lights caught his badge, making it gleam as he drew closer to the scene unfolding before him. The biker leader had his hand stretched out, fingers nearly grazing Mr. Chen's wallet, when a calm, authoritative voice cut through the tension. "Good evening, gentlemen. Is there a problem here?" The words, though softly spoken, carried across the gas station with unmistakable authority. The effect was immediate. The younger bikers straightened up, their previous bravado faltering as they realized a police officer now stood just a few feet away. The leader, however, maintained his composure, slowly withdrawing his hand and turning to face Officer Rodriguez with a practiced smile. "No problem at all, officer," the leader said, his voice dripping with false friendliness. "Just helping our elderly friend here with the gas pump. You know how complicated these new machines can be." He attempted to place a seemingly friendly hand on Mr. Chen's shoulder, but the elderly man took a step back, moving closer to his car where Mrs. Chen watched with wide eyes. Officer Rodriguez's trained gaze took in every detail of the scene, the way the other bikers were positioned around the station, the trembling hands of Mrs. Chen still holding her phone, the relief washing over Mr. Chen's face. "That's very thoughtful of you," he replied, his tone making it clear he wasn't buying the act. "But I believe Mr. Chen has been managing just fine at this station for years." The fact that the officer knew the elderly man's name caused a ripple of unease among the bikers. What they didn't know was that Officer Rodriguez had often seen the Chens at their granddaughter's restaurant, where he frequently stopped for lunch. He had always admired how they helped out there on busy weekends, despite their age. Now, Officer Rodriguez continued, casually adjusting his position to stand between the bikers and Mr. Chen, "I couldn't help but notice your bikes when you pulled in. Mind if I take a closer look? I used to ride myself." His hand rested casually on his belt, near his radio, a subtle reminder of his authority. The leader's face twitched slightly, his false smile becoming strained. He knew this dance well, the officer was giving them an out, but also a warning. "Sure thing, officer," he replied, trying to maintain his cool demeanor. "The boys and I were just about to head out anyway. Long ride ahead of us." As if on cue, the rumble of approaching police sirens could be heard in the distance. The backup Officer Rodriguez had called for was arriving. The younger bikers began shuffling toward their motorcycles, their earlier confidence completely evaporated. Mrs. Chen finally lowered her phone, her other hand reaching out to squeeze her husband's arm as he returned to the car. The couple shared a look that spoke of decades of facing challenges together, a silent acknowledgement that they were safe now. The leader gave one last look at Officer Rodriguez, a mix of frustration and grudging respect in his eyes. "No harm done," he said, beginning to back away. "Just a misunderstanding." But the officer's steady gaze told him that this encounter would be remembered, documented, and followed up on if necessary. As the bikers mounted their motorcycles, Officer Rodriguez pulled out his notebook, making a show of writing down their license plate numbers. The message was clear, they were being watched, and their actions tonight would have consequences if they tried anything similar in the future. 2 more patrol cars pulled into the station just as the bikers started their engines. The officers emerged, taking in the scene with professional interest. The night shift supervisor, Sergeant Thompson, approached Officer Rodriguez while keeping a watchful eye on the departing bikers. Mr. Chen had finally managed to start filling his tank, his hands now steady as he went about the familiar task. Mrs. Chen had rolled down her window and was speaking softly to Officer Rodriguez, her voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her accent thick with emotion. "We see you at our granddaughter's restaurant. You always so kind to her." The officer smiled warmly. "Golden Dragon makes the best dumplings in town, Mrs. Chen. I wouldn't eat anywhere else." His casual reference to their family business brought a proud smile to both their faces, helping to dissolve the last remnants of fear from the evening's events. As the bikers roared out of the station, their tail lights disappearing into the growing darkness, Sergeant Thompson began taking statements. The security cameras had captured everything, and the incident would be thoroughly documented. But more importantly, word would spread through the local biker community. Pine Grove was not a place to cause trouble. The gas station returned to its usual quiet state, but something had changed. The Chens had experienced firsthand what their granddaughter had often told them about Officer Rodriguez, that behind his badge was a guardian who truly cared about the community he served. And in a world that sometimes seemed increasingly indifferent, that knowledge was worth more than any amount of intimidation could ever take from them. The following day, the Golden Dragon restaurant buzzed with more activity than usual. Word had spread quickly through the tight-knit community about the incident at the gas station. Regular customers dropped by not just for their usual orders, but to check on the elderly couple who had become fixtures in their small town over the decades. The Chen's granddaughter, Jenny, moved between tables with practiced ease, serving steaming plates of food while fielding concerned inquiries from patrons. Despite her worries, she couldn't help but feel touched by the community's response. Every few minutes, someone would ask about her grandparents or share a story about how the couple had touched their lives over the years. In the kitchen, Mrs. Chen insisted on helping with the dim sum preparation as she did every morning, her skilled hands folding dumplings with the same precision she'd learned in her grandmother's kitchen back home. "Cannot let fear change who we are," she told Jenny in their native language, her voice firm despite the lingering anxiety from the previous night. Mr. Chen sat at his usual spot near the register, greeting customers and doing the morning calculations. Some might have expected him to stay home after such an ordeal, but he believed in facing life head-on. "In all our years here," he told a concerned regular customer, "we see more good than bad. Last night reminded us of this." Around lunchtime, Officer Rodriguez entered the restaurant, out of uniform but still carrying himself with the same quiet authority. The lunch crowd buzzed with murmured conversations, many having heard about his role in the previous night's events. He took his usual seat at the counter, but today felt different. Jenny approached him with a pot of tea, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "My grandparents told me what you did," she said softly, pouring him a cup of the jasmine tea he always ordered. "They've been here since I was a baby, building this place, making a home in this community." The thought of someone trying to... Officer Rodriguez raised his hand gently, his expression understanding. "Your grandparents represent the best of this town," he replied, his voice warm. "They've served this community for decades. Last night, the community had a chance to serve them back." As they spoke, Sergeant Thompson entered the restaurant, carrying a folder under his arm. He joined Officer Rodriguez at the counter, nodding respectfully to Jenny. "Good news," he said, keeping his voice low. "We've identified most of the group from last night. Turns out they're part of a small outfit that's been causing trouble up and down the coast. Several other jurisdictions are very interested in our security footage." The news spread through the restaurant like a ripple in a pond. Regular customers exchanged satisfied nods, while Jenny hurried to the kitchen to tell her grandparents. The Golden Dragon had always been more than just a restaurant, it was a community hub where people shared not just meals, but their lives. In the kitchen, Mrs. Chen wiped her hands on her apron and closed her eyes briefly, saying a silent prayer of thanks. Mr. Chen placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, the gesture speaking volumes about their shared journey. They had faced challenges before, the struggle of immigration, building a business from scratch, raising a family in a new country. Each challenge had only made them stronger. As the lunch rush continued, something remarkable began to happen. Local business owners started dropping by, not just for lunch, but to offer support. The hardware store owner volunteered to install better lighting in the restaurant's parking lot. A local security company offered to donate a modern camera system. The auto shop owner insisted on checking over the Chen's car, refusing payment. Officer Rodriguez watched it all unfold with quiet satisfaction. This was why he had become a police officer, not just to confront the bad, but to protect and nurture the good. He saw how the community rallied around the Chens, turning what could have been a traumatic event into a demonstration of unity and support. Later that afternoon, as the lunch crowd thinned, Mr. Chen approached Officer Rodriguez's seat. He placed a carefully wrapped package on the counter. "Special dumplings," he explained, his eyes crinkling with warmth. "My wife make them just for you. Family recipe, very old." The gesture wasn't just about the food, it was about belonging, about acknowledgement of the bonds that held their community together. Officer Rodriguez accepted the package with both hands, showing respect for the tradition behind the gift. "Thank you," he said simply, but his eyes conveyed much more. As evening approached, more officers from the local force stopped by for dinner, each receiving the same warm welcome that had made the Golden Dragon famous. Mrs. Chen emerged from the kitchen more often than usual, personally thanking each one, her natural grace and dignity untouched by the previous night's events. The day drew to a close, but something had fundamentally shifted in Pine Grove. The incident that could have left a community scarred had instead revealed its strength. The Chen's story had become more than just a tale of harassment prevented, it had become a reminder of how a community could stand together, how decades of kindness and hard work could build a fortress of goodwill stronger than any threat. As Jenny helped her grandparents close up for the night, she noticed them standing together by the window, looking out at their beloved restaurant and the town beyond. "America," Mrs. Chen said softly to her husband, "still land of dreams." Mr. Chen squeezed her hand gently, both of them understanding that their American dream wasn't just about success, it was about being part of something bigger than themselves. A week after the incident at the gas station, Pine Grove was experiencing an unexpected ripple effect. The local newspaper had picked up the story, not focusing on the harassment, but on the community's response. The article, titled "Small Town, Big Hearts," had caught the attention of nearby communities, turning the Golden Dragon into something of a symbol of community solidarity. The morning started like any other at the restaurant, with Mrs. Chen preparing her signature dishes in the kitchen. However, she paused when she heard an unusual sound from outside, the rumble of motorcycle engines. Her hands froze over the dough she was kneading, and Mr. Chen quickly moved toward the front window. But these weren't the same bikers from the gas station. Instead, they saw a group of riders from the local motorcycle club, the Valley Veterans, pulling into the parking lot. Their leader, a retired Air Force pilot with silver hair, walked in first, removing his riding glasses and looking around the restaurant with respect. "Mr. and Mrs. Chen," he called out gently. "I'm Jim, president of the Valley Veterans. We heard about what happened last week." He held up his hands in a peaceful gesture as he saw their initial concern. "We wanted to let you know, those guys who bothered you. They don't represent what riding is about. We're here to make things right." Jenny emerged from the kitchen, standing protectively near her grandparents. Officer Rodriguez, who happened to be having his morning coffee, watched the scene unfold with interest but remained ready to step in if needed. However, his instincts told him this was different from last week's encounter. Jim continued, his weathered face sincere. "Our club has members from all walks of life, including many who came to this country looking for a better life, just like you did. We respect that journey. We protect our community. From now on, the Golden Dragon is under our watch." As if to demonstrate his sincerity, he pulled out a folder. "We've also gathered some information about those troublemakers from our network. We'd like to share this with the police department, if that's okay." He glanced at Officer Rodriguez, who nodded appreciatively. Mrs. Chen, always the gracious host despite her initial fear, disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a tray of freshly made spring rolls. "Please," she said, gesturing to the large corner table, "sit, eat. Any friend of community is friend of ours." The scene that followed was something Pine Grove would talk about for years to come. The veteran bikers, still in their leather vests decorated with military patches, sat down to an impromptu feast of traditional Chinese cuisine. They listened intently as Mr. Chen shared stories of his journey to America, finding surprising common ground in their shared experiences of leaving home to serve a greater purpose. Throughout the day, more members of the Valley veterans dropped by. Some came on their lunch breaks from their regular jobs, teachers, mechanics, nurses, showing the Chens that appearances could be deceiving. Each one made a point of telling the couple that they now had friends in the riding community. Officer Rodriguez used his lunch break to review the information Jim had provided. It turned out the harassment at the gas station wasn't an isolated incident. The troublemakers had been targeting vulnerable business owners up and down the coast, usually moving on before local law enforcement could build a case. By late afternoon, the restaurant had become a curious mixture of its regular customers and leather-clad bikers, all sharing tables and stories. Jenny couldn't help but smile as she watched her grandmother teaching one of the veterans, a burly man with tattoos covering his arms, how to properly fold a dumpling in the kitchen. The local news crew showed up, drawn by the unusual sight. But instead of a story about conflict, they found one about bridges being built. They captured footage of Mrs. Chen sharing cooking tips with the bikers' wives who had joined their husbands, while Mr. Chen played Chinese chess with Jim, both men deep in concentration. As evening approached, Jim stood up to address the restaurant. "Mrs. Chen, Mr. Chen," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a natural leader, "the Valley veterans have a tradition. When we find good people who've been wronged, we make them honorary members of our family." He pulled out 2 leather vests, specially made with the club's logo and the words, "Honorary Members," embroidered in both English and Chinese. The elderly couple accepted the vests with tears in their eyes, understanding the significance of the gesture. Mrs. Chen, usually reserved, surprised everyone by putting hers on immediately over her apron, standing proudly as photos were taken. "Next Saturday," Jim announced, "we're organizing a charity ride. All proceeds will go to the local cultural center security upgrade fund. We want to make sure what happened to you never happens to anyone else in our community." Officer Rodriguez, who had returned for dinner, watched the scene with satisfaction. In his years of service, he'd learned that sometimes the best way to fight darkness was not with force, but by bringing people together, letting them discover their common ground. The day ended with promises of future visits, exchanges of phone numbers, and plans for the charity ride. As the last of the veterans rode off, their bikes rumbling into the sunset, Mr. Chen turned to his wife and said something that made her laugh for the first time since the incident. "Maybe we need to learn to ride motorcycle now?" That night, as Jenny helped her grandparents close up, she noticed something different. The fear that had lingered in their eyes since the gas station incident was gone, replaced by the same strength and determination that had brought them to America all those years ago. They had not only survived another challenge but had turned it into an opportunity to strengthen their community bonds. The week leading up to the charity ride transformed Pine Grove in unexpected ways. The Golden Dragon became the unofficial headquarters for the event planning, with Jim and his fellow veterans spending their evenings there after work, hunched over maps and registration forms while enjoying Mrs. Chen's cooking. The restaurant's back room had turned into a command center of sorts. Hand-drawn routes were pinned to the walls, while sign-up sheets grew longer by the day. What had started as a simple charity ride had evolved into something much bigger, a full-day community festival celebrating unity and diversity. Mr. Chen, despite his initial reservations about motorcycles, found himself fascinated by the planning process. He sat with Jim for hours, offering suggestions about potential rest stops and pointing out scenic routes he discovered during his decades of early morning supply runs for the restaurant. "This road here," he said one evening, tracing a line on the map with his weathered finger, "most beautiful sunrise in county. Mountains look like paintings from my homeland." Jim made note of the route, understanding that this ride was becoming more than just a statement against harassment, it was becoming a bridge between cultures. Officer Rodriguez stopped by regularly, not just to help with the security planning, but to witness the extraordinary transformation taking place. He watched as Mrs. Chen taught some of the veterans' wives her secret dumpling recipe, while they in turn showed her how to design custom patches for riding vests. Jenny had taken charge of social media promotion, and the response had been overwhelming. Riding clubs from neighboring counties pledged their support, and local businesses rushed to sponsor the event. The auto parts store offered free safety checks for all participating bikes, while the local print shop donated hundreds of posters featuring a stunning design that combined traditional Chinese elements with motorcycle imagery. But perhaps the most touching development came from an unexpected source. The town's children, inspired by the story, had started a parallel initiative at their schools. They were creating handmade welcome cards for new families in the community, each one decorated with motorcycles and Chinese dragons drawn in crayon. One afternoon, as Mrs. Chen was teaching a group of bikers' wives how to make traditional moon cakes, a surprising visitor entered the restaurant. It was one of the younger bikers from the gas station incident, looking nervous and out of place. The room fell silent as Officer Rodriguez moved closer to the door, but the young man raised his hands in a peaceful gesture. "I came to apologize," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. What I did, it wasn't right. I've been thinking about my own grandparents, who came here from Poland. They faced similar things." He pulled out an old photograph from his jacket. This was them, 40 years ago, opening their first bakery. Mrs. Chen wiped her hands on her apron and approached him slowly. She looked at the photograph, then at the young man's face, seeing beyond his tough exterior to the shame and regret in his eyes. Without saying a word, she guided him to a table and disappeared into the kitchen, returning moments later with a plate of dumplings and a cup of tea. "In our culture," she said softly, sitting across from him, "sharing food is way of healing. Your grandparents understand this too, yes? Bakery, restaurant, we feed people's bodies and souls." The young man's eyes welled up with tears as he realized he was being offered not just food, but forgiveness. The news of this interaction spread quickly through the town, adding another layer to the already powerful story. The young man's courage in coming forward and Mrs. Chen's grace in forgiveness became a testament to the transformative power of community and understanding. As Saturday approached, the weather forecast threatened rain, but nobody seemed concerned. Jim joked that they had friends in high places, pointing to the military service backgrounds of many club members. The Valley veterans had arranged for covered rest stops along the route, and local farmers offered their barns as backup locations for the festival. The Chen's granddaughter Jenny had another surprise in store. Working with local art students, she had created a special banner for the ride. It featured a golden dragon intertwined with a motorcycle, symbolizing the unexpected alliance that had formed. The Chinese characters for unity and strength were woven into the design, alongside the English words, Pine Grove rides as one. Mr. Chen, inspired by all the activity, made his own contribution to the event. He decided to share his story of coming to America, writing it down with Jenny's help. Copies would be distributed at the festival, not as a tale of hardship, but as a testament to the American dream and the power of community support. The evening before the big event, the Golden Dragon hosted a special dinner for everyone involved in the planning. The restaurant was filled to capacity with an unlikely mix of people, veteran bikers, local business owners, police officers, and families who had supported the cause. Mrs. Chen had outdone herself, preparing a feast that combined traditional Chinese dishes with American favorites. The centerpiece was a massive cake decorated with both Chinese and American symbols, created by the young bikers' family bakery as a gesture of reconciliation. As the sun set on that Friday evening, casting a golden glow through the restaurant's windows, Jim stood up to make a toast. "Tomorrow," he said, raising his glass, "we ride not just for the Chens, but for every person who has ever felt like an outsider. We ride to show that Pine Grove stands together, no matter what." The room erupted in applause, but it was the quiet tears in Mrs. Chen's eyes that truly captured the moment's significance. She and her husband had come to America seeking a better life, but they had found something even more precious, a community that had become family. Saturday morning arrived with a spectacular sunrise, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. the very colors Mr. Chen had promised would greet the riders along his suggested route. The Golden Dragon's parking lot, usually quiet at dawn, was already alive with activity as bikes began rolling in from all directions. Mrs. Chen had been up since 3 a.m., preparing hundreds of breakfast buns for the riders. The restaurant's kitchen hummed with energy as volunteers helped pack these traditional treats into rider bags, each one accompanied by a handwritten note of thanks in both English and Chinese. By 7 a.m., the scene had transformed into something Pine Grove had never witnessed before. Over 300 motorcycles lined the streets around the restaurant, their chrome gleaming in the morning sun. Riders from across the state had shown up, many wearing custom patches that combined their club logos with Chinese symbols for peace and unity. Officer Rodriguez, who had volunteered to coordinate security for the event, couldn't help but smile at the irony. Just 2 weeks ago, the sight of bikers near the Golden Dragon had sparked fear. Now, the restaurant was the epicenter of the largest community gathering the town had seen in decades. The Chen's granddaughter Jenny moved through the crowd, distributing route maps and emergency contact numbers. She paused frequently to take photos for the event's social media coverage, capturing moments that showed the incredible diversity of the gathered crowd, leather-clad bikers chatting with local families, children sitting on parked motorcycles while their parents took pictures, and veteran riders helping newcomers check their equipment. At 8 a.m., Jim called everyone together for the pre-ride briefing. Standing on a makeshift stage, actually the back of a flatbed truck decorated with Chinese lanterns, he cut an impressive figure in his riding gear. But it was the presence of Mr. and Mrs. Chen beside him, both wearing their honorary Valley Veterans vests, that drew the loudest cheers from the crowd. Today, Jim announced, his voice carrying across the hushed gathering, "We're not just riding for fun. We're riding to show that Pine Grove protects its own. We're riding to prove that what makes America great isn't our differences, but how we come together despite them." Mr. Chen stepped forward, something he rarely did in public settings. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke, but his words carried the weight of decades of experience. "When we come to America, we have dream of better life. Today, you all show us we find more than better life, we find best community." The crowd's response was deafening, a mixture of cheers and revving engines. Mrs. Chen wiped tears from her eyes as she watched young children from the local Chinese-American community hand out small red envelopes to the riders, a traditional gesture of good luck that the Valley veterans had insisted on incorporating into the event. As the riders prepared to depart, a surprise awaited the Chens. Jim unveiled a custom-built motorcycle sidecar, painted in the golden colors of their restaurant's logo. "Mr. and Mrs. Chen, would you do us the honor of leading our first loop through town?" The elderly couple exchanged glances, a mixture of excitement and nervousness on their faces. With careful assistance, they were helped into the sidecar, which had been specially modified for comfort and safety. Jim would be driving, with Officer Rodriguez riding alongside as an escort. The sight of the elderly couple, still holding hands after all these years, seated in the sidecar of a gleaming motorcycle, would become one of the most shared photos from the event. The ride began with a slow procession through downtown Pine Grove. Streets were lined with residents holding signs of support, many featuring messages in both English and Chinese. The local elementary school had organized a special cheering section, with children waving hand-drawn flags combining American stars with Chinese dragons. As they passed the gas station where the incident had occurred, something remarkable happened. The station owner had set up a free coffee and refreshments stand for the riders, with a large banner reading, "Pine Grove stands united against hate." The young attendant working that day was none other than the apologetic biker from earlier in the week, now proudly wearing a "Community First" t-shirt. The main ride took the participants along the scenic route Mr. Chen had suggested, and he beamed with pride as riders repeatedly stopped to photograph the stunning vistas he had promised. At each rest stop, local businesses had set up welcome stations, offering everything from water and snacks to basic bike maintenance. One particularly moving moment came when the procession passed Pine Grove's Veterans Memorial. The riders formed two lines, creating an honor guard as Mr. and Mrs. Chen's sidecar passed between them. Many of the veteran riders saluted, acknowledging not just the memorial but the courage it takes to build a life in a new country. Local news crews followed the event, capturing the spirit of the day. Their cameras recorded more than just a charity ride, they documented a community redefining itself. Interviews with participants revealed story after story of how the Chens had touched lives over the years, helping families celebrate special occasions, offering meals to those in need, providing first jobs to countless teenagers. By mid-afternoon, the ride returned to the Golden Dragon, where an even larger crowd awaited. The parking lot had been transformed into a festival ground, with food stalls offering a mixture of Chinese and American cuisine. The Chen's regular customers had set up a photo exhibition showing the restaurant's history, from its humble beginnings to the present day. The festival portion of the event brought even more surprises. Local martial arts students performed traditional lion dances while the Valley veterans' families organized motorcycle skill demonstrations. Children moved between activities, getting their faces painted with dragons and motorcycles, while their parents shared stories and food. The fundraising total, when announced, exceeded everyone's expectations. Not only would they be able to upgrade security for the cultural center, but there were enough funds to establish a community unity grant, supporting future initiatives that brought different groups together. As the sun began to set on this extraordinary day, Mrs. Chen looked around at the scene before her, bikers sharing tables with local families, children teaching each other words in different languages, old barriers crumbling in the face of shared humanity, and whispered to her husband, "This is American dream we never dare to dream." The weeks following the charity ride brought unexpected changes to Pine Grove. The event had captured attention far beyond the small town's borders, inspiring similar initiatives in neighboring communities. The Golden Dragon, once simply a beloved local restaurant, had become a symbol of how communities could transform acts of intimidation into movements of unity. Local businesses reported a surge in visitors from surrounding towns, many coming specifically to experience the atmosphere they'd heard about. The restaurant's guest book filled with messages in various languages, each sharing stories of how the Chen's experience had resonated with their own family histories. One quiet Tuesday morning, as Mr. Chen was doing his usual inventory count, a sleek black car pulled up outside the restaurant. A well-dressed woman stepped out, introducing herself as a representative from the state's Department of Community Affairs. She carried a letter announcing that the Chens had been nominated for the Governor's Excellence in Community Building Award. "Your story," she explained, sitting at the counter while Mrs. Chen prepared her signature jasmine tea, has inspired a new statewide initiative. "We're launching a program to help different community groups connect and support each other, just like what happened here in Pine Grove." The Valley veterans had made the Golden Dragon their unofficial clubhouse, with members regularly stopping by for meals and conversation. What started as a gesture of protection had evolved into genuine friendships. Jim and his wife now joined the Chens every Sunday after church for dim sum, a tradition that other families in the community began to embrace. The young biker who had returned to apologize became a regular presence at the restaurant too. He'd started taking Chinese language lessons from Mrs. Chen, while sharing stories about his grandparents' bakery. Together, they were planning a special event combining traditional Chinese moon cakes with Polish pastries, a fusion that symbolized Pine Grove's growing cultural connections. Officer Rodriguez noticed other changes in his daily patrols. The gas station where the incident had occurred had become a model of community policing, with the owner installing well-lit rest areas for travelers and hosting monthly community meet and greets. The young attendant had started a "Pay It Forward" board, where customers could prepay for gas or snacks for those in need. Jenny's social media updates about the restaurant now reached audiences across the country. She shared daily moments of cultural exchange, veteran bikers learning to use chopsticks, Mrs. Chen teaching local kids how to make paper lanterns, Mr. Chen playing chess with retired servicemen. Each post garnered thousands of likes and comments from people sharing similar stories of community transformation. The security footage from the original incident had taken on new significance. Local schools requested permission to use it as part of their anti-bullying programs, not to focus on the harassment, but to highlight how the community's response had turned a negative situation into a positive movement. One morning, the Chens arrived at their restaurant to find the sidewalk decorated with chalk art. Local children had covered the concrete with drawings of dragons, motorcycles, and messages of love in multiple languages. Among the artwork was a particularly touching scene, a drawing of Mr. and Mrs. Chen in their honorary Valley Veterans vests, surrounded by a heart made of motorcycles. The cultural center's security upgrades were completed ahead of schedule, thanks to volunteer labor from the Valley veterans and other community members. But the improvements went beyond security cameras and better lighting. The center had expanded its programs to include Culture Share nights, where different community groups could showcase their traditions and stories. Mrs. Chen's cooking classes, once attended primarily by other Chinese American residents, now had a waiting list that included people from all backgrounds. She had to move them to the community center to accommodate the growing interest. Each class became a story-sharing session, with participants swapping family recipes and migration tales while learning to fold dumplings or prepare soup bases. The town council took notice of the positive changes and established an annual Unity Ride and Cultural Festival, ensuring that the spirit of that first charity event would continue. They also created a community response team, trained to turn potential conflicts into opportunities for connection and understanding. One evening, as the sun set over Pine Grove, Mr. Chen stood in front of his restaurant, watching the usual mix of cars and motorcycles in the parking lot. A group of veteran riders was helping him install traditional Chinese lanterns for the upcoming Mid-Autumn Festival, while local teens recorded the process for a school documentary about the town's transformation. "You know," he said to Officer Rodriguez, who had stopped by for his usual dinner, "when we first come to America, we worry about fitting in. Now look, we help others fit in too." He gestured to a table where Jim was teaching some newcomers to the town about Chinese tea ceremony etiquette, something Mrs. Chen had shown him over their Sunday dim sum sessions. The restaurant's walls, once decorated solely with traditional Chinese art, now displayed a collection of photographs chronicling the town's journey. The centerpiece was a large print of the Chens in the motorcycle sidecar, their faces beaming with joy, surrounded by hundreds of riders from all walks of life. Local business schools began using Pine Grove as a case study in community engagement and crisis management. They analyzed how a potential tragedy had been transformed into a movement that strengthened the entire community. The Chens found themselves invited to speak at conferences and community events, sharing their story of how love and understanding had triumphed over fear and intimidation. As autumn approached, the Valley veterans surprised the Chens with yet another gesture. They had secretly commissioned a new sign for the restaurant, one that combined the original Golden Dragon logo with subtle motorcycle imagery and the words, "Where community comes together," in both English and Chinese. Mrs. Chen, upon seeing the sign, hugged each veteran in turn, her eyes brimming with tears. In Chinese tradition, she explained, dragon represents strength and good fortune. Now we add new meaning, dragon represents community too. The story of the Golden Dragon and Pine Grove continued to inspire others, proving that sometimes the worst moments can bring out the best in people. What started as an attempt to intimidate had instead revealed the true strength of a community, not in its ability to exclude, but in its power to embrace and transform. 1 year after the incident at the gas station, Pine Grove had become a different place entirely. The Golden Dragon celebrated its 35th anniversary, and the celebration encompassed far more than just the restaurant's success. It had become a celebration of community transformation, resilience, and unity. The anniversary celebration was planned as a 3-day event, drawing visitors from across the state. The Valley veterans had coordinated with riding clubs from neighboring states, organizing commemorative rides that would converge on Pine Grove. Local hotels were booked solid, and residents opened their homes to visitors, embodying the spirit of community that had become the town's hallmark. On the first morning of the celebration, Mr. Chen arrived at the restaurant earlier than usual. In the pre-dawn quiet, he stood in front of the building, remembering that fearful night at the gas station. A rumble of motorcycles broke his reverie. It was Jim and a few other veterans, arriving to help with the preparations. "Hard to believe it's been a year," Jim said, clapping Mr. Chen on the shoulder. "You know, what those guys tried to do that night, they thought they were showing power. Instead, they showed us all what real strength looks like." The morning unfolded with a series of events that showcased how far the community had come. The local high school's multicultural club, which had grown significantly over the past year, performed a fusion dance combining traditional Chinese lion dance movements with contemporary styles. The performers wore custom costumes that incorporated both Chinese symbols and motorcycle imagery, a combination that had become Pine Grove's unique signature. Mrs. Chen had trained a team of volunteers from different backgrounds to help prepare the anniversary feast. The kitchen was a symphony of languages and laughter as they worked together, sharing stories and techniques. The menu itself told the story of the past year, traditional Chinese dishes alongside American classics, each with its own fusion twist developed through countless Sunday sharing sessions. Officer Rodriguez, now promoted to Community Relations Lieutenant, arrived with a special surprise. The State Police Department had chosen Pine Grove as the location for their new cultural sensitivity training program, using the town's transformation as a model for other communities. What happened here, he announced to the gathering crowd, wasn't just about stopping harassment. It was about showing how a community can turn fear into friendship. The young biker who had returned to apologize had his own announcement to make. Standing beside his grandmother, who had flown in from Poland for the occasion, he revealed that he was opening a cafe next door to the Golden Dragon. The cafe would specialize in Polish-Chinese fusion pastries, a concept born from his baking lessons with Mrs. Chen and his grandmother's traditional recipes. "A year ago, I was part of the problem," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Today, thanks to the Chen's forgiveness and this community's example, I'm part of something much bigger. We're calling the cafe Bridge and Blessing, because that's what Pine Grove taught me about." As the day progressed, the streets filled with visitors participating in various activities. The cultural center hosted workshops where people could learn everything from dumpling making to basic motorcycle maintenance. Local artists had created an interactive mural where visitors could add their own messages of unity in any language they chose. Jenny had organized a documentary screening, compiling footage from the past year. The film showed not just the dramatic moments, but the quiet ones too, everyday scenes of people from different backgrounds coming together, learning from each other, and building something new. The screening ended with a standing ovation, not just for the film, but for the journey it represented. The highlight of the celebration came at sunset, when hundreds of motorcycles paraded through town, led by Mr. and Mrs. Chen in their now famous sidecar. But this time, they weren't just passengers. Over the past year, Mr. Chen had earned his motorcycle license, inspired by the friendship of the veterans. The sight of him piloting the sidecar while Mrs. Chen waved to the crowds brought tears to many eyes. As night fell, the parking lot of the Golden Dragon was transformed into an outdoor celebration space. Tables stretched as far as the eye could see, filled with people sharing food and stories. Chinese lanterns hung alongside motorcycle-themed decorations, creating a warm glow that seemed to embrace everyone present. The Governor's Excellence in Community Building Award, which the Chens had received earlier that year, held a place of honor inside the restaurant. But more meaningful were the hundreds of personal notes and cards displayed alongside it, each telling a story of how Pine Grove's transformation had touched someone's life. Mrs. Chen, watching the celebration from her favorite spot near the kitchen, shared a quiet moment with Jenny. "You know," she said, her eyes twinkling, "in old country, they say good fortune can come from bad times, like lotus growing from mud. But this?" She gestured to the scene before them. "This more than good fortune. This is American dream we never knew to dream." The celebration concluded with a surprise announcement from the town council. They had unanimously voted to update Pine Grove's official motto to "Where differences drive us together," a reference to both the motorcycle community that had helped transform the town and the diverse cultures that now called it home. As the final day of celebration drew to a close, Mr. Chen stood to address the crowd. His English, while still accented, carried the confidence of someone who knew he was among family. 1 year ago, some people try to make us feel we don't belong. Today, we all belong together. In Chinese tradition, we say, "Wan xing tong tang," all things work together for good. Pine Grove show us this is true. The Golden Dragon incident, as it came to be known, had rippled far beyond Pine Grove's borders. Other communities facing similar challenges reached out for guidance, leading to the creation of a network of towns committed to turning potential conflicts into opportunities for growth. The story of an elderly couple at a gas station had become something much more, a testament to the power of forgiveness, the strength of community, and the ability of people to change. As the last motorcycles rumbled away and the cleanup began, Mrs. Chen turned to her husband and said something that perfectly captured the journey of the past year: "Sometimes best adventures start when we most afraid. But brave heart and kind community make fear turn to love." Pine Grove had shown that the true measure of a community isn't in how it handles its best moments, but in how it transforms its challenging ones. The Golden Dragon, once simply a restaurant, had become a beacon of hope, proving that sometimes the most powerful response to hatred is not more hatred, but an overwhelming display of unity and love.